Hello, welcome. I'm Karen Rothman. I'm the Associate Director of Public Humanities, and I work with Matt Jacobson and Laura Wexler, who are the Directors of Public Humanities. And this, before I introduce Emily Barnard, I just want to tell you just briefly that this is part of the Democracy in America series of talks, and we have talks here and at Yale, and at the Ives branch of the New Haven Public Library. So I hope that you'll come to as many events as you can. If you want to subscribe to our newsletter, just write subscribe to Public Humanities at yale.edu, or ask me afterwards. Give me your name afterwards. Our next library talk is at the Ives branch on February 4th, a talk called Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity. It'll be a really good talk with Daniel Hosang and Joe Loans. So I want to thank the library because this is a series that we really love, both at the Wilson branch and the Ives branch. Louis Chavez Brumel, the branch manager, Marion Huggins, who runs the Urban Life Experience Book Discussion Series. I think there's some members of that series here today. On January 11th and the 13th, the subject was Emily Barnard's new book, Black is the Body. And I also want to thank Seth Godfrey, who's the manager of reference and adult learning at the New Haven Public Library, because he's helped us set this event up. So now to our speaker. Emily Barnard is the Julian and Lindsay Green and Gold Professor of English at the University of Vermont. She teaches courses in critical race and ethnic studies. She holds a BA and a PhD in American Studies from Yale University. She's published many books and essays, including Remember Me to Harlem, The Letters of Langston Hughes and Carl Van Vechten, which was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. And if you haven't read it, I recommend it so highly. I taught parts of it last year, and my students absolutely love this book. Also, some of my best friends, writers on interracial friendship, which was a notable book by the New York Public Library, and Michelle Obama, the First Lady in Photographs, which received a 2010 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work. In 2012, her book, Carl Van Vechten and the Harlem Renaissance, A Portrait in Black and White, was published by Yale University Press. And she also provided an amazing intro to Nella Larsen's novella, Passing, for the Penguin Classics series. Her essays have been featured in Best American Essays and Best African American Essays, in Best Creative Nonfiction, in New Republic, in American Scholar, in the Boston Globe. And the book she'll be speaking about and reading from tonight, which is called Black is the Body, Stories from My Grandmother's Time, My Mother's Time, and Mine, was published last year by Knopf to stellar reviews and much acclaim. I also should mention that it was the very best day of reading of my year 2019. I spent the day on my couch reading this book, and it was a complete pleasure. The book was featured on Oprah.com's 25 Books We Can't Wait For. It received multiple printings, and it's now in paperback. You can read more about Emily Barnard at emilybarnard.com, which I recommend. And lastly, I guess I wanted to say that we've been looking forward to this event since July when we planned it. And I've been worried since July that it was going to snow today. So I want to thank the weather. It's cold, but it's not snowing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Everybody. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm going to project like thusly. And I want to thank Karen for that wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. It really is homecoming. And it's great to see so many friends. Michael Moran at the Beinecke, it's so great to see you. So this is a delight for me, and I am honored to be invited, Karen and also Marion, for making this possible, Matt Jacobson. So thank all of you, thanks you for coming out. I want to take you on a little journey through this book, if you don't mind. And we have some time then for discussion afterward. I'm going to start at the beginning, which is aptly titled Beginnings. This book was conceived in a hospital. It was 2001, and I was recovering from surgery on my lower bowel, which had been damaged in a stabbing. A friend, a writer, came to visit me in the hospital and suggested not only that there was a story to be told about the violence I had survived, but also that my body itself was trying to tell me something, which was that it was time to face down the fear that had kept me from telling the story of the stabbing, as well as other stories I needed to tell. I began to write essays. The first one I published was Teaching the N-Word. Over the next few years, more essays followed, along with several attempts to write about the stabbing. I couldn't tell that story yet because I didn't know what it meant. It took 7 more years for me to understand that the experience of being at the wrong end of a hunting knife was only the situation, not the story itself. It was the stage, not the drama. In the situation and the story, the art of personal narrative, Vivian Gornick writes, "The situation is a context or circumstance, sometimes the plot. The story is the emotional experience that preoccupies the writer, the insight, the wisdom, the thing one has come to say." The setting of scar tissue, which is the essay I eventually wrote about being stabbed, is my gut. The blood let flow by the knife is a trail I followed until I discovered the story, which is the mystery of storytelling itself, and how hard it is to tell the whole truth. Each essay is anchored in this mystery in blood. They are also rooted in contradictions, primary among them being that the stabbing unleashed the storyteller in me. In more than one way, that bizarre act of violence set me free. But of course, the stabbing has been a source of misery as well as opportunity. For instance, I suffered from recurrent, excruciating stomach pain for many years before another trip to the hospital revealed that I had developed adhesions in my bowel. The surgeon was able to untangle my intestines and scar tissue, but he warned me that the adhesions would return. There was nothing I could do to prevent or predict them. "You're just unlucky," he said sympathetically. The pain, he assured me, would be random and severe. It did return, thundered again throughout my body, and sent me back to the hospital, where a third surgeon ceded to the inherent malady of the mystery and confessed that medicine was more art than science. The gift of his honesty was, to me, as valuable as any solution would have been. Once I accepted the randomness of the situation in my bowel, life took on a new urgency, and so did the desire to understand it. I turned to art over science, story over solution. I found a voice. The book, imagined in 2001, began to take shape in a need to know, to explore, to understand before it was too late. Insofar as a personal essay is at best an attempt to grasp the mysteries of life, the form made sense to me on a visceral level. The need to understand, in fact, was what it engendered the stabbing in the first place. I met the knife head on. Something in me just needed to know. Each essay in this book was born in a struggle to find a language that would capture the totality of my experience as a woman, a Black American, a writer, teacher, mother, wife, and daughter. I wanted to discover a new way of telling. I wanted to tell the truth about life as I have lived it. That desire evolved into this collection, which includes a story about adoption that is as pragmatic as it is romantic, a portrait of an interracial marriage that is absent of hand-wringing, and a journey into the inward that includes as much humor as grief. These stories grew into an entire book meant to contribute something to the American racial drama besides the endearing narrative of Black innocence and white guilt. That particular narrative is not false, of course, which accounts for its endurance. But there are other true stories to tell, stories steeped in defiance of popular assumptions about race, whose contours are shaped by unease with conventional discussions about race relations. These other true stories I needed to explore, but I was mainly driven by a need to engage in what Zora Neale Hurston calls the oldest human longing, self-revelation. The only way I knew how to do this was by letting the blood flow and following the trail of my own ambivalence. I was not stabbed because I was black, but I've always viewed the violence I survived as a metaphor for the violent encounter that has generally characterized American race relations. The man who stabbed me was white, but more meaningful to me than his skin was the look in his eyes, which were vacant of emotion. There was no connection between us, no common sphere, yet we were suddenly and irreparably bound by a knife, an attachment that cost us both. Him, his freedom, me, my wholeness. Revisiting that wound has been a way of putting myself back together. The equation of writing and regeneration is fundamental in Black American experience. So if race was not an essential factor in what brought me into contact with a hunting knife, I've certainly treated the wound with the salve I inherited from people whose experiences of blackness have shaped their lives as fully and poetically as it has shaped mine. Blackness is an art, not a science. It is a paradox, intangible and visceral, a situation and a story. It is a thread that connects these essays, but its significance as an experience emerges sometimes randomly and unpredictably in life as I have lived it. It is inconsistent, continuously in flux, and yet also a constant condition that I carry in and on my body. It is a condition that encompasses beauty, misery, wonder, and opportunity. In its inherent contradictions, utter mysteries, and bottomlessness as a reservoir of narratives, race is the story of my life, and therefore Black is the body of this book. I always forget to include the trigger warning when I write the first pages of this book. Some of you in here are intimately familiar with the experience I write about. The stabbing, the story that I used as a frame of this book, took place in New Haven. It was August 7th, 1994, and a man who was a paranoid schizophrenic and off of his medication, as simple as that, came into coffee it was on Audubon Street. And that's the beginning of the story. I included it at the beginning because I was thinking a lot about Toni Morrison, what she wrote about the bluest eye, and how the point of the book was not the trauma of what happened to Pecola, Breedlove, but it was the why of the whole thing, And the story of the stabbing is, to me, something I've been wrestling with as I've grown as a human being, as a writer and a teacher. I was interested in the way the story defined me and has defined me beyond my own power and my intentions. I'm going to read a little bit from that essay. On the night of August 7th, 1994, I walked into a coffee shop called Coffee on Audubon Street in New Haven. I was a graduate student in the American Studies program, and I was there to work. I had James Weldon Johnson with me, specifically his 1912 novel, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, about which I was writing a paper. I was having a hard time concentrating that night, so I went to Coffee, which was not far from where I lived and was one of the many spaces in New Haven where students went to read and write and talk. It was a typical coffee shop in a typical college town. I was frustrated with my work, so frustrated with my inability to concentrate that I was giving the evening only one last chance. It was late, nearly 9 o'clock. Maybe too late, maybe call it a night. I debated with myself, walking slowly the 3 yards from my car to the door of coffee. I was probably talking to myself, as I do all the time, muttering about all that I had to do. A man on a bicycle and I approached the door at the same time. Beside him stood an average-size, average-looking brown dog on a leash. The man was listening on his bike, rocking side to side, as if he himself had not made the commitment to go inside the shop. Maybe, maybe not. Our eyes met. He looked like Gallagher, the 1970s comedian, the same long hair and bald pate, the same thick mustache, or at least that's what I remember. To this day, when I think of Daniel Silva, I think of Gallagher, whom I rarely, if ever, thought about before that night. I don't remember who went in first, but I remember making the decision not to let the oddness of this stranger bother me, because he was odd. It was the way he was listening on his bicycle. It was the unsettling way he looked at me. His look was familiar, or too aware, not the passing glance of a stranger. Even now, I have a hard time describing it. He was odd. It was instinct. I knew something was wrong with him. Or maybe this is just a cliche of hindsight speaking. After all, we're talking about a university town and a coffee shop full of nerds, off in their own little worlds, people who routinely talk to themselves out loud, as I had been doing that night. Here I've lingered longer than I lingered in that moment, which passed as quickly as a proverbial blink of an eye. I looked at the man, made a quick unconscious association with Gallagher, went in to get my coffee, and planted myself at a table. I put my keys on the table. I pulled out my book and notepad. I took off my glasses and my watch. No distractions, just me and the page, as naked as I allow myself to get in public. At some point I looked up and noticed that the strange man had settled into a chair not far from me. I was aware of him as he watched a table full of young girls next to me, presumably undergraduates. They were talking about a sexual encounter one of them had had recently. The girls were loud, sexy, and full of swagger. I had been feeling annoyed by them and their devil-may-care bluster, but now I looked up and saw that the man was staring at them, obviously and apparently salaciously. I felt intimidated by his frank stare, but I looked at the girls and they didn't seem to care, which made me proud of them and emboldened for myself. Go ahead, talk about sex, I thought. Don't let this freak scare you. Eventually the girls left. When they did, the man turned his attention to a young woman I imagined to be a medical student or a law student, judging from the size of her very official-looking textbooks. She tried to engage him in conversation. She said something like, "Hi." I didn't hear his response, but I do know that not long after this exchange, the woman gathered up her books and left. What happened next? Here's what I told Detective C. Willoughby at 1:30 a.m. on August 8, 1994. This detective then spoke with blank, who stated that she was sitting inside the restaurant when a white male came in who had a dog. She then stated that he walked the dog outside and then returned. He then pulled out a knife and started stabbing people. She stated that he stabbed her once in the stomach and that she then fled the restaurant. She stated that she had never seen the white male subject before and she does not know him. I remember stillness, the hum of low voices and the lights, bright yet soothing like the talk surrounding me. People talking and laughing quietly. Students, professors, writers. I was the only black person present, but these were people just like me, who looked like me. So many moments like these over the years, in coffee shops, in so many cities, all forgettable, ordinary, and uneventful. But these particular moments on this particular evening stay with me more palpably than any other moments from that long night. The stillness, the quiet, the hum of low, pleasant talk, the sensation of being inside of those moments, it is the only real memory I retain from that night. Yet just beyond the borders of that quiet, pleasant memory, I can still hear the rhythmic, continuous sound of a dog barking outside like a warning. Suddenly, chaos, pandemonium, bedlam, topsy-turvy, madhouse, a holy mess, all hell broke loose. The room turned upside down, on its back, inside out, went crazy, flipped out. Other words, other cliches. Fear erupted like a seismic shift in the Earth's surface, and then charged and pierced and saturated the room like smoke. Fear, a good friend to me that night, chased me toward the back door. But even in the midst of this utter confusion, I paused and listened for gunshots. This was America, after all. I paused not only to listen for the gunshots, but to brace myself, literally tense my shoulders, grit my teeth, and search inside somewhere for the pain, the tearing impact of a bullet. When I completed that brief inventory and discovered no bullet, I was overcome by a feeling of relief, hope, luck, a chance, and a door right behind me, and I ran. And then I was outside in the back of the coffee house. There were no lights. It was as dark as the bottom of a pocket. Others rushed by me. I don't remember if they were speaking, shouting, screaming, or crying. What I remember is silence, which seemed inexplicable to me even then. I would find out later that what occasioned that queer silence was adrenaline pounding in my ears and deafening me. I don't know how long I watched others rush past me before I walked back toward the coffee shop. I don't remember how long I stood there trying to understand before everything in me rejected what I saw. And I charged back into the shop to retrieve my watch, my keys, and glasses so that I could drive home. Why did I do this? It doesn't make any sense. But however I try to explain it, my stubborn West Indian heritage, a Freudian state of denial, the same thing happened next. I found myself face to face with the odd man, and he had a knife in his hand. At this point, the knife would have been covered in blood. I don't remember the blood. I do remember asking him not to kill me. I meant it, of course, but at the same time, it just seemed like the thing to say. I felt I was playing a role. I felt that the die was cast. I had turned and met my fate. But I was watching as much as I was experiencing. My witnessing was involuntary. In the autobiography of an ex-colored man, the anonymous narrator recalls being fixed to the spot while he watches a white mob lynch a black man. Like the narrator, I was fixed to the spot. Why? I did not move because I did not want to excite this man. I did not move because I had to see what was going to happen next. I did not move because I was afraid. I did not move because I was free from fear, as many report feeling in the moments before death. I did not move because I knew that he would hurt me if I did. I did not move because I knew he would not kill me. I did not move because I didn't believe he had the knife I saw in front of me. I did not move because I did not know what to do. Maybe all of the above, maybe none, maybe some combination. I will never know for sure. I was more afraid of being in the dark without my eyeglasses than I was of running into the man with a knife again. I've been wearing eyeglasses since I was 8 years old. The last time I had gone without my glasses in public, I was not allowed to walk down a street without holding the hand of an adult. I had never been on a city street alone without my glasses. I was on the eve of my 27th birthday when I was stabbed. The last time I had been out in public without my glasses, I was not permitted to be awake at 10:24, which is the time it has become at this point in the story. A figure ran toward me, a man. I was afraid. I stopped. He must have seen my fear, this man, because he waved his hands in the air and shouted, "I'm a good Samaritan, a good Samaritan." I trusted his words and his biblical reference and let him lead me to some steps across the street. This is from Officer Petoniak's incident report, composed at 22:24 on August 7, 1994. This investigating officer did find one white male subject and one black female subject on the stairs of an apartment complex located across the street from 24 Whitney Avenue. Both subjects had stab wounds to the stomach areas and were bleeding profusely. Due to the extent of the injuries and calling for medical assistance, this officer was not able to obtain any identification of the victims. What's your name? What's your social security number? I fired these questions at the white male subject shortly before Officer Petoniak arrived. The young white man, who I'd never seen before, was sitting on the steps a few feet away from me. He was going into shock, and I was trying to keep him from doing so. I kept up my round of questioning, and he mumbled some answers. I'm going out, he said, and fainted. It was only then that I really looked at him. He's white as a sheet, I thought, literally white as a sheet. This is what it looks like. The young white man had pale skin, light blonde hair, and wore a white Oxford shirt. The contrast between the blood in his skin, hair, and shirt must have been dramatic, but I don't remember the blood. I watched him. The more he faded away, the less able I was to ignore what was happening just under my hand. An EMT came close to me and asked about the young man, and I answered him. I talked and talked, told my story, posed as a witness, even as I was seeing sparks and hearing static, and the EMT's badge started to blur. Trained to recognize the signs of shock, the EMT cradled my head and took my hand away from my side. His gloved hand, like my bare hand, became wet with blood. He said something to his partner, who was tending to the white male subject. Suddenly, there was a commotion around me. He laid me down carefully on the steps. He held my bloody hand as his team moved me onto a gurney. At some point, our eyes met and we laughed. The more I laughed, the more I came to. The more I laughed, the more my wound gaped open, which made us laugh even harder. It was all so absurd. The same EMT came to visit me in the hospital before I went into surgery. He seemed somber and shaken. Watching him look at me, I realized that my situation was dire. I tried to mirror his grave expression and warned myself that getting stabbed was serious business. But I wanted to laugh with him again. The incident still seemed mostly ridiculous. I'll leave it there. As I said, that whole experience has shaped a lot of my adult life, and not just because of the obvious drama of it, but also because, as I said in the introduction, I have had to keep making visits back to the hospital because of adhesions. For a while, they were happening at 7-year intervals. There's something really comforting about the biblical significance. There are all these sevens in the story. It was 27, it was August 7th. And so once we hit the 8-year mark, my husband and I thought, okay, we really nailed this thing. You know, but then I turned my book in, actually, a few months before I turned my book in. And yet again, and I was so sure it wasn't adhesions. I actually successfully talked my surgeon and convinced him that I thought my appendix had burst. This is, a memorable moment in storytelling. Because he was really, I think he was just confused, but I was sure my appendix had burst. I had no more adhesions. But I learned a valuable lesson, of course, about the power of narrative or lack thereof. But also there's something, as I started to research to write this story, just encountering myself in hospital records, newspaper reports, and police records as a black female subject, and thinking about representation and how often black people are reduced to these descriptors. And there's something about me, I think, that just needed to put flesh on the skeleton of the idea of this black female subject and tell this story. But there are many versions of this incident. In fact, Bruce Shapiro, who is an amazing journalist, has a piece called One Violent Crime. It's a different perspective on what happened, but it happened to both of us. I like to think of myself as having inherited something from the literary ancestors that I hold dear, and I'm sure many of you hold dear in this room. The power of language. I gave a talk recently, and a young man asked me, he said, "Do you ever feel that you need to hide your blackness? Do you ever feel you have to throw up screens, depending on your social circumstances?" Of course, the answer is yes. But I'm black all the time, I told him. I'm black when I'm walking my dog in the woods of Vermont, and I'm black when I'm giving lectures on African American literature and discussing the nature of American racial identity. I'm black when I'm writing about race, and black when I'm not writing about race. I'm always a black writer, and I'm always telling black stories. In an essay on in this book, I talk about the experience of learning at a young age about the limits of narrative when it comes to black experience. I spent so many years determined not to be a consequence of history and believing that I could invent my own story. But as I write in the book, that was before I understood that the drive to create a new story for oneself is the oldest black story there is. I am a black writer. I care about literary legacy and inheritance, about the body of work, but even more, I care about the shape of a story. I like lines, gaps, blank spaces, all of the things that can't be captured in language. The form is the story, and the story is in the form. These are lines from an essay that actually came out today from the Yale Review called Stereopticon. And I think the same question animates that essay in the book, just how do we know what we know, and how do we tell stories? From what perspective are stories authentic? My book is about being a mother and a daughter as much as anything else. It is a record of what I've learned and what I'm learning as I'm parenting now teenage girls. Yes, 13, it's just a joy every day. We laugh and hug. So please allow me to read a little bit from the title story, Black is the Body. Black history. My brown daughters were becoming black when they were 6 years old. They were watching television one day in February, Black History Month. A commercial came on. It was more like a 30-second history lesson, a commemoration of a pilot, a poet, or a politician. A first black, as a writer I know calls them being the racial pioneers, the inaugural Negroes, the foremost African Americans to break through racial barriers in their chosen fields. By break through, I mean, of course, secure the regard of white people. "See, we're black," Julia said to Isabella. "No, we're brown," Isabella responded. "Yeah, but they call it black," Julia explained. I thought that was great. The end. I thought that was wonderful. And I have to say, I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but it was in that exchange I thought, okay, there's a book here somewhere You know, that kernel of that, this is fascinating. Despite my efforts to shield them, my daughters had somehow gotten wise to the absurd and illogical nature of American racial identity. Blackness, Julia had figured out, had nothing to do with actual skin color. Blackness, she had come to understand, was an external identity, external to her anyway. Race was something other people identified, something they said but not necessarily saw. Blackness, she had intuited, was a social category, not a color, but a condition. And like it or not, it was time she was informing her sister to get with the proverbial program. In spite of me, but also because of me, my brown daughters were becoming black. My heart sank. It was not blackness per se that caused my heart to sink. I enjoy being black. But it took me a long time to get here, to this place of racial pleasure. My earliest experiences of blackness were defined by an unpleasant and uncomfortable hypervigilance. Being black meant that you had to be constantly aware, that you could never really be at ease. Early on, I got wise to the fact that being black in a white place meant that the world was not a safe place, not for you. In my family, race was not a construction or a theory or an outdated consequence of history, but the active living foundation of our reality. Race determined the contours of every choice we made. Every mundane public act we performed was a project with a name. When we moved into our house, it was called integration. When my older brother and I entered the public school system, it was called desegregation. The split between black and white was not metaphorical. Railroad tracks divided black and white Nashville. On the white side of town, South Nashville, we played a role in a grand project of enormous proportions. We lived in South Nashville, but in North Nashville, we could be black in a way that was not possible in any other part of the city. In North Nashville, no one white was watching. We could relax. We were free. North Nashville was where my father practiced medicine and where we attended events at Fisk University, my parents' alma mater, and one of this country's oldest HBCUs. North Nashville was where we attended church in a small chapel that was established for the faculty and students of Meharry Medical College, from which both of my parents received their graduate degrees. Among the parishioners in the chapel were men and women I called aunt and uncle, even though we had no biological relationship. We shared something bigger and more profound than blood, history. Inside the church, we celebrated our belief in God and a common pride in how we all made it over and broke through. We were a community, a black community, built in spite and because of racism. Because if it had not been for white supremacy, schools like Fisk and Meharry might never have existed. But my daughters were not born under the shadow of this history. They are black by ideology and affinity, but not by blood. When they were 12 months old, they assumed dual citizenship in both America and African America. Once, when we were out of town visiting my husband's extended family, I told them the Black History Month story. I tried to explain my reasons for having wanted to protect my daughters from the language of race, but my explanation seemed only to make them impatient. Don't you want them to know their history? John's cousin asked. I should say my husband's, he's Italian American, he's white. I knew what she meant. She meant American slavery, segregation, and the civil rights movement. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Rosa Parks, Martin, Malcolm, and other first blacks. February stories, which as American stories belong to her, this white American woman, more than they do to my daughters. I am an African who lives in America, Isabella explained one day. She was recounting a conversation she had had with a third-grade classmate. The African Children's Choir had come to Burlington, and the class had taken a field trip to see them perform. Later that day, Isabella's classmate, in an attempt to identify the difference she perceived between Isabella and the children on stage, had referred to Isabella as an African American. Isabella corrected her. While the law may state that I am an American, I am African. When I came to this country, she continued, astonishment made it difficult for me to continue paying attention. That my daughter had such a fine sense of her place in the world I had not known. Her implicit assessment of my role as essentially a porter in the stage of her life journey felt wholly appropriate. I was just carrying the bags, apparently. My daughters and I flipped through picture books of 12th century Ethiopian underground churches carved out of rock. I showed them websites that feature both centuries-old drawings and modern photographs of Ethiopian kings and queens. Yours is the only African country to fight off the colonizer, I remind them often. Every mother thinks her daughters look like angels, but my daughters do resemble the doe-eyed, haloed brown cherubs that dominate Ethiopian Orthodox Christian iconography. Why did white people make black people slaves? Isabella asked one February afternoon. There's been slavery all over the world, I told her, even in Ethiopia. I'm proud that my daughters were born in a world where not only slaves, but angels and aristocrats look like them. As my daughters get older, it's fascinating to watch them create their identities. The other night, Julia texted me from a party. She had told a close friend of hers that she was Italian. And the friend rejected this. And I said, you're the author of your identity. And you tell this boy that if he understands the mystery of identity, I'd like to hear that, because it's still a mystery to many of us. And I told her she was free to invent her own name. I want to read a little bit from the story I wrote about, the essay I wrote about making a family, the four of us. And of course, my story here is going to be radically different from theirs, so I can only attest to my own experience. So at this point, my husband and I are on the trek to the family's home. And I think everything else is pretty self-evident. We drive slowly as the road thins and then disappears, as if it has surrendered to the commanding natural landscape around us. Helen, our American adoption agent, had told us the road would end and we would have to walk for an hour to meet the girls and their family. Marjorie, another adoption agent, dismissed this information as another one of Helen's fantastic stories. Guillermo pulls a car to a gentle stop among small bunches of beaver-tail cactus with stems as wide and flat as paddles and decorated with bristles like stubble on a man's face. There are only 3 yards between us, but the men's voices sound tinny and far away. Underneath my feet, the earth is as light and packed as brown sugar. Within arm's reach is a small island of green bordered by a layer of rocks. In its center stands a tree with a thin trunk and a flowering crown, like a tall, skinny kid with an afro. In the distance, more trees, some dense and willowy, stand in line on stand in a line on faded, cracked earth. The sky is thick with all the blue left in the world. I nearly trip on titanic pieces of shale. My boots catch in the valley of crevices between them. The sun quickly discovers the skin beneath my hair, hat, and the rest of my clothing. I feel its piercing impact in my joints and lungs. As we approach a group of thatched huts topped with perfect cylinders of green, long grass, my heart beats so rapidly that I reflexively cover it with my hand. I smooth my shirt and adjust my hat. I hope I look like what the family wants for their twins. As we are greeted by the people to whom the girls belong, I imagine a woman being presented to a groom at the inauguration of an arranged marriage. Be prepared to be treated like royalty, Helen had written in an unusually helpful email. Indeed, the girl's family has slaughtered a sheep in our honor. A large platter of the roasted sheep meat sits on a clay table. The loaf of bread we bought in Adigrat is placed on the side. Everyone gathers to eat, but after a few token bites, I sit back on a bench molded from the same clay as the table and walls of the wide circular room. I try to arrange my features into an expression that communicates my appreciation for the food, my desire to enjoy it, and my inability to do so. I am not successful. It is clear from the quality of the murmurs. Emily doesn't like it, Berhanu says, and smiles sympathetically. I can tell he is trying to translate the disappointment I have caused. It is terrible to know that I'm failing to demonstrate the boundless depth of gratitude I feel for everyone in this room. A torrent of emotion clogs my throat. My palms sweat and tingle. I am rigid with anticipation, eager for the wonderful, terrible moment in which the girls will be placed in our arms. Beside me, John eats heartily and drinks sheep's milk from a tin cup. I cannot say no when the milk is offered to me. I feel multiple pairs of interested eyes on me as I bring the cup to my mouth. The twins' grandmother brings out the baby we will know as Isabella. She is wrapped in the same light blue quilted outfit that she wears in a picture that Helen sent months ago. Her grandmother, a slight woman with a lightly wrinkled face, stands in a space that separates two rooms of the family home. The sky shines a movie star light down on the two of them. Isabella regards me dispassionately as she takes in the entire scene. Julia emerges mid-wail. She is afraid because she has never seen white skin, Berhanu says, and gently touches John's arm. Julia continues to cry as we stand outside the compound and are presented with carrots so bright and large they could serve as props in a Bugs Bunny cartoon. John gathers us for a photograph before we begin the trek back to the Land Rover. The return hike feels more arduous, the sun hotter, the air drier. I am trying not to show my exhaustion. The grandmother has a swaddled Isabella on her back. Her steps are light and efficient on veins of rock that protrude from the earth. I walk next to one of the baby's cousins, a girl of 11 or 12. Her eyes are large and kind. The braids in her hair shine. She wears Julia, who seems to be dozing on her back underneath a cloth secured to her faded green dress. We take turns looking at each other and then looking away before the other one catches us. There's so much I want to ask and tell her, but the membrane of language, fine and opaque at once, travels with us like a mobile glass partition. Even though it feels a bit silly, the next time I sense her looking, I meet her gaze, and for the second time today, put my hand over my heart. I press down hard. When she looks away, she is still smiling. You are a part of our family now, an older male cousin tells us, but that's it for goodbyes. John and I are hustled into the car, whose rumbling engine inspires more caterwauling from Julia. The babies are shuffled around. I hold Julia, who screams and stares at me with tears cascading from her eyes. Isabella rests quietly in John's lap, snug in the nest of his arms and chest. Suddenly she sits up and opens her mouth slightly. Sheep's milk spills out of her tiny body. Julia follows suit. Before her second round, I take my hat and turn it upside down under her chin. 3 hours later, we have become almost used to the smell and the feeling of our daughter's vomit caked on our clothing. We are sticky with heat and sweat and bodily fluids by the time we arrive at the airport in Mekelle. John leaves the girls with me while he rushes to the bathroom to clean out my hat and rinse Isabella's excretions from his shirt. With a baby tucked into the crook of each arm, I sink into a plastic chair. My dizziness and blurry vision must be a result of the heat, I think. An older woman wearing a black hijab sits down next to me. She holds her arms open. I hand her Julia, and she pulls a small blanket from her belongings and hands it to me. She and John each take one of my arms when it's time to board. I still feel rickety as we walk toward the plane, but I have a firm grip on Isabella, who emerges from the cloth on my shoulder as slowly as a plant sprouting from the earth in a time-lapse video. She stretches her neck like a periscope and pivots her head slowly, a stern look on her face, like a general assessing a battlefield, or Magellan surveying the Atlantic, I think. And when she smiles, I believe we are sharing our first private joke. Julia has decided that it is my particular job to tend to her, so John and I trade babies once we are seated. She and I fall asleep quickly after takeoff. A few minutes later, a wave of pain propels me out of my seat and toward the bathroom. Along the way, I shove a miserable, indignant Julia into the arms of a pretty flight attendant. I am on my hands and knees in the throes of thudding, seizing abdominal pain when the attendant knocks on the door. As soon as I undo the latch, she snatches the door open. I look up. She is stony. I am perpendicular. "Madam, your baby," she sniffs, and presents me with Julia, who looks down at me with what appears to be alarm on her 12-month-old face. I have a lot of stomach gut issues in this book. I realize it. But something that, one of my doctors said to me, all the mythology around the gut, and I actually had a physician who, I was lucky to encounter a surgeon who didn't like to cut. And he just looked at me and he said, this seems strange, but to cut into you and you look perfectly healthy. And the adhesion, I was in Yale, New Haven, and everything untangled naturally. And I said, what made you not want to go in? And he said, it was a gut instinct. It's true. Anyway, yes, this book the stories are definitely etched inside of me in many ways. My daughters will never know my mother. And the book really belongs to my mother, who was a consummate storyteller and inherited that trait from many generations that came before her. They only have these stories, of course, the stories I tell them, and the stories that are in this book. I'm still learning the lessons of my mother's life. And one of the most instructive stories that I have the pleasure and the honor of carrying, I discovered toward the end of the book. I'm going to read a little bit from that piece. It's called my epilogue called My Turn. A few years after my mother died, I discovered a cache of papers she left in my childhood bedroom closet. She buried them in an act of elegant and amusing symbolism underneath a pile of my father's long-forgotten wrinkled shirts. The papers consisted mainly of poems, drafts and drafts of them, but there are a few essays. I hadn't known she wrote essays. One of them is an autobiographical narrative about her life as a child in the Jim Crow South. It's called My Turn. When my mother was a child, she often accompanied her beloved grandmother, Mama Timpy, to a local grocery store. In order to get to the store, they had to walk past rental houses owned by a lumber company. One day, some white boys threw rocks at the two of them. A pleasant stroll turned into a nightmare, my mother wrote. Mama Timpy, who practiced the kind of black stoicism that has served as a guiding principle for African Americans since the inception of African presence in this country, walked on without evincing any emotion while the white boys jeered and pelted them with stones. When my mother asked Mama Timpy why they were being treated that way, her grandmother told her that the boys didn't know any better and should be pitied instead of hated. My mother idolized Mama Timpy. She accepted her grandmother's reasoning and, as an adult, went on to practice the same kind of forbearance that made Mama Timpy the embodiment of strength and moral fortitude in the poetry my mother wrote. But the rock still wounded. She wrestled with the wounds in My Turn. Her grandmother's keen analysis of the nature of racism, that it was a consequence of ignorance, did not stem the flow of blood that ran down her leg. After reading the story, I knelt on the floor, my heart racing. I reached the final lines and then started all over again. I was looking frantically for something. What was it? I didn't know, but I kept scanning the lines over and over, my throat tight and my breath short. There was something I needed that I didn't see. What is it? I kept asking myself as I read the paragraphs again and again, and then searched through her other papers, looking and looking. For what? Some words to correct the abomination of the rocks and my mother's bloody leg. And then I realized that what I was looking for was the salve, an answer, the end. For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it must always be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness, James Baldwin explains. It took me a while. It took the journey of this entire book, but I realized that there was a lesson, which was, in every scar there is a story. The salve is the telling itself. Thank you. I'll stop there. Any comments or questions? So many friends here tonight. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Nancy.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful reading. Would you mind talking about how your daughters feel about your writing about them and whether or not they're interested in telling stories and how they think about their place in narrative?
I love that. You know, you and I have talked about this so many times, and it's definitely an ongoing question. It's really different to write about 3-year-olds than 13-year-olds. Go figure. So now we have to strike all kinds of bargains because it's a different moment for them as they start to, yes, invent their own stories and have. My My daughter Julia was like, "You're always embellishing recently." I thought, oops, she found me out. You could help repeat stories about her and add a little flesh to it, a little drama, a little lighting. But it's still the emotional truth I tell her. But I was I have to say, I wrote an essay called "What Will Your Daughters Think?" because that question is definitely with me. The question, how are they going to use, how are they going to experience themselves now that people have a hold of their lives in a different kind of way? I asked Julia once, I said, what is this like? And she said, well, they're stories about us. It's not us, which I loved. One, because it gave me a nice little out there, you know. But I love the way she sort of start to think about it. Like, these are representations of us. They're stories from our lives together. And my daughters are definitely storytellers. They are learning to make narratives, you know, from the stuff of their lives. And the book has been, in some ways, another now vocabulary or set of images that we now use to talk about ourselves as a family. So the book has played that funny role as a product of the stories I've lived with them, but also helping us invent new stories. I think that question about writing other people is something I'm always interested in, what, you know, to hear from authors about how they navigate that question. And I wrote a recent story, actually the story that's up at the Yale Review now, has a scene, a problem, a moment between Julie and myself. And it was actually a moment when she asked me, she said, you know, I don't want you to ever read that out loud. I said, okay, that you know. But we talked about the role that scene played in the essay. And I think that we came to an understanding about those boundaries, you know, and we keep it, you know, having to understand them differently as I get older. But, you know, I made a decision a while ago that I think that I believe in the utility of the stories that I tell. We think like that should come first, you know. And I may be called into an office at some point and I may be told that you know, that this was actually not, you know, I may be on the therapist's couch hearing about how this was like ruined their lives, and I will pay that price. But at this point, you know, the book feels like our book. But as I move into the next set of writings, you know, as they develop their own private lives, you know, I have to obviously respect that. But as I tell them, if you leave your diary in my office, I'm going to read it. And I don't know, if it's in there, I assume that's subconscious. You're offering me this. But it's a constant way where I think we're navigating and understanding, you know. We'll see. It'll be another essay. Yes, Karen.
I was curious, one of the things that I found so amazing in the Carl Van Vechten Langston Hughes book is the way they're shaping their identities in part, I guess, in terms of our understanding about them now from what they aren't saying to each other. And I guess I was curious about some of the things that you left out of this book, and how your sense of identity is shaped both by what you do include and what you don't.
I like that a lot. I always, you know, I guess I want to talk about, yeah, I feel, the older I get, the more I feel, I'm an educator, you know, by profession, but also by nature. And this book feels very real to me as an extension of my life in the classroom, you know. I live in the books that I teach. They're so central, they've been guideposts for me as I've grown, learning how to live from James Weldon Johnson and James Baldwin and Toni Morrison and so many other writers. So I'd like to think of this book as being in conversation with those books. And I'd like to think of it primarily doing that kind of work. I teach at the University of Vermont, and I teach African American studies. So I presume when I start in the classroom, I'm starting at zero. And you know, teaching is that linear work we have to do. And you start here, you get your students here. But when I am writing, I can meander, and I can contradict myself, and ask questions that are, and reveal things that are not conducive to that linear work in the classroom. But I think that they go hand in hand. And so what I think I leave out of my teaching, that vulnerability, the ambivalence, those stories are here in the book, and then sort of vice versa. You know, what's here in the book is not necessarily going to appear in the teaching. I think of myself primarily as an essayist. You know, the book is, you know, memoir and essays. It wasn't my idea, honestly. You know, it was the very cold eye of publishing, the idea that, you know, memoirs have this sort of life now, and there's concern on my editor's part that if the word essays might actually was not as warm and inviting as stories. So that's why we have them here. But I think of these essays as doing, you know, each one doing a kind of discrete job, although they are obviously together and united together. I included an essay that is not in the book. Is an essay called Fired. And I like the essay. I wrote it, I can't remember, it was 2006 or 7. I think it was published in 2007. And it was about the breakup of a friendship. I decided not to include it in the book because and it gets back to Nancy's, you know, the kind of larger issue of writing about other people. But at the time I wrote the essay, I didn't write it with malice in my heart, but I didn't write it with, I think, the same sense of purpose that I have now, an understanding of what my goal is, you know, here to do this kind of work. When I published it, I got a letter. I published it in the American Scholar, and I got an email from a man who wrote me and said, I hope you will feel free to answer this question. If you had to do it again, or rather, if you could choose the essay or the friendship, which would you choose? And at the time, I mean, I thought about it, but I said the essay. And, you know, there are certainly a lot of writers who feel that way, you know, story first, and I respect that. But for me, that feeling of that has evolved, has changed, you know, from those early years. So I didn't include it because I felt this book was unified around a vision I have developed since I wrote that essay. So I left it out. I wanted it to make sense and to cohere, you know, and to take hopefully the reader on a journey through not only different stories but moods and you know, different tempos. And that book fell outside of that larger goal, you know, to give that variety of experience. It felt out of the picture I was trying to paint. So there was I was very consciously shaping not only the essays, but even, the book, but the essays too. And when I said earlier that I think a lot about the shape of a story, my essay, Teaching the N-Word, I wrote it deliberately against, you know, the kind of mandate that happens as an educator to give people a straight answer, you know, don't use that word, you know. I wanted to, again, to sort of follow and gingerly some kind of ambivalent trail and think about the implications of the word and present a series of scenarios and questions. And in my mind, the gaps in that essay are kind of invitations for a writer to enter, reader, and kind of invent and supply some of his or her own, the fodder there. You understand what I'm saying? So it's meant to be porous in that way. So a lot of the things I left out were about trying to leave room for the reader. You know, I wanted this book to feel participatory. I wanted it to feel like a friend and like something you could confide in, you know, as a breathing entity. I wanted it to be a compassionate and a good listener, you know, as much as it was about the stories it was holding. So in order to do that and to provide that feeling that has helped me so much, you know, and inform my own taste in reading, I thought about that with the shaping of all of the different essays, you know, and how to leave room for the reader's own experience, you know what I'm saying? Not to lock down a question, but to open it up. And that really motivated me a lot as I was working. So thank you. I like that question because it really is about what is left out down to the, you know, down to the gaps in paragraphs. Yes?
Sort of piggybacking off that question, and also thank you very much, especially reading it with your voice. It's very particularly powerful. This is sort of related to the idea of what's left out, but in the sense that we are in democracy in America. My questions always kind of come down to, especially since this is such a long-term project from 2001, how did conceptualizing of this change with, or did it change with politics itself as well?
Question.
Obviously,
Yeah.
you know, but also, you know, thinking about all these aspects of the way Nature Academy, whether it has changed, or the ownership of narrative, the ownership of nomenclature, all these kind of aspects, and I can only imagine what you're writing in 2001 and what comes out published in 2019, a very different time period. I was, you know, 11, and I can imagine, I could see television, you know, what was going on, and what were the crises to me, and what I thought my own identity was. And 18 years later, I'm a completely different person with a completely different understanding of identity and story and situation, as you're saying. So,
Yeah, I like that. And don't you find that you're a totally different person, but also find I'm totally the same? One of the things I loved about I got to love getting to know Carl van Vechten when I was, you know, working on him, and he said that at 81, he said, I look in the mirror and I'm the exact same person as I was when I was 18, and I get closer. God willing, to, you know, I think that's so true for me as well. So that changing same that Baraka, it applies to our lives as much as music. I mean, you're right. I mean, a whole, you know, writing life and writing self developed in those, you know, in those years. In terms of politics, you know, I'd never felt more urgency about the need to do the work. I don't know about those of you who are writers, you know. We have things to say before, you know, before who knows what's next. So I feel that urgency. In my classrooms, I tell my students, you know, what we're doing now is we're practicing good citizenship. That's what we need now. I think that in this world, you know, I suffer from a lack of nuance. You know, when we are consuming the world around us, you know, where are the muted gray areas? You know, where can we think through something in beautiful ways? And so I feel that urgency even more. I also, you know, as I guess in these desperate times, what do I believe? And I believe in narrative. I believe in storytelling. I believe in testimony. I think that has transformative powers. I've seen it in my classrooms when the students can tell the stories of their lives in ways that where they see the connections to themselves and other people, they're liberated. So a new urgency, certainly. Ideas that, what are the stories that are not being told that need to be represented? I think as images of blackness, as black people, our bodies are being used as piñatas. It's possible to consume images of people being killed. I mean, in fact, that's not shocking at all to us anymore. How did this happen? What is the corrective? And I think we dignify each other by allowing the layers to flourish. When I hear, doing the story recently, it wasn't that long ago, the woman who was at the side of the road and a cavity search was conducted on her body without her permission. And I thought, I want to give her the throne of language in a story, because to be reduced to that incident in a police report, that's how we dignify each other and give each other, I think, our access to our full humanity. So I believe this with more passion than I ever have, and it's the only way I know how to cope with this political environment, is to talk back, with honest work. And frankly, the mission right now is to be part of the project of dignifying Black lives, with narrative. So I have a more sense of that mission now. It's all I have to offer. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thanks for coming. I really enjoyed your stories. I wanted to ask you, you were talking about the coffee event, and you gave pause and you dignified his illness. You said that, he was schizophrenic, and I felt like you had some compassion for him. And I was wondering if you ever contemplated if that perpetrator was Black, and how that story would have been told differently. Would it have been an exogenous event, or would it be another expression of Black criminality?
That was very interesting. Absolutely. I mean, everything you're saying is, yes, I agree with you. I'll say to the first part that, if anybody had died as a result of this crime, I think the story would have changed. I don't know that I would be here. I don't know if it had been possible for me to talk about it in the way that I do, And it's also true that other people who were, survived that incident are affected very differently. This is my own version of the story. I'll tell you another story that's in the book in terms of race and violence and representation. As I say in the essay, it's the hardest part of that essay for me, and the hardest part of that experience, was what happened with the surgeon after. And I tell this story. It was the hardest part of the book to write. But the first surgeon who was with me that night, when I was lying on the gurney and completely terrified and bewildered, walked up, and without saying anything to me or looking at me, he plunged his fingers into my open wound. And when I grabbed his arm instinctively, he said, "Don't touch my hand." I was more terrified at that moment than I was by the man who stabbed me. And so I think if you say, yes, compassion, there's mental illness in my family, it's hard to disconnect that, it's just from what he was, and it really was political. He was deinstitutionalized too early because he was, because of Ronald Reagan, So, the history, it's impossible to, I think, separate from that context. But certainly as I was on that gurney, what I understood immediately, through the haze of drugs, was that this surgeon saw this Black body on the gurney who was a victim of a knife wound and made a lot of assumptions about my value and how to treat me, So, it's a reality many of us live with, and every time I'm back in the hospital, I always have to make sure, and I'll say to certain, have you read these studies that, suggest that, these myths that Black people don't experience pain in the same way, and I always I have to make sure. So that to me was a moment that I never felt that terror and that powerlessness in realizing this person's not even seeing me at all. And right, it was a very different experience than looking into the eyes of someone who was just not home. I know that if the look we'd exchanged had been one of knowing it would have been a different experience. And it made it, in some ways, more terrifying to see someone who was just not present. But it also, again, made it something that was deeply impersonal. Sometimes when I'm in New Haven, I think, am I going to run into him, you know? That would be very strange. I don't know if I'm ready for that. But I think that before I wrote the part about the doctor, I had to research, find out where he was, and I had to write him a letter. Tell him what he did and the impact of that, and whether or not he ever received it, I don't know. But I hope it at least ruined his day, and maybe be a little education to pass on. But I think from that experience, again, because it keeps revisiting me, so I've had to consider it from so many different angles. It was something that I had to lay claim to in some way, and again, write about it in a way that gave me the authority. You know, his story ended that night, but then I've had to live with it in my own way and make sense of it. You know, I think this book was about learning to work with those with those wounds. The way I think as Black people we have had to, make this American experience something meaningful. So that's what that essay has done and why it plays such a central role in this book, really. But thank you. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but I love that supposition. And yes?
I'm curious in terms of how far ahead you plan the courses that you're going to teach yourself. How much of it is what you're asked to teach? How much do you choose to teach? And how much impact your personal life experience has in your teaching? And if you try to separate the two, or do you try to infuse it?
I like that. Well, I'm very fortunate to teach at a university. I get to pretty much pick what I want to teach. So I don't have to, I can be creative and I can take risks and teach new things. I don't have to work within really strict parameters in terms of the courses I can offer. So I taught a class, for instance, this fall called James and Joan, the American Essay. And we were just sort of making it up as we went along. And it was a work in progress kind of situation. In terms of, everything that I teach comes out of the love of the books, the loves of books that have meant so much to me. So it's very personal. But in teaching the N-word in the essay, I write about that struggle. I teach, again, at a place where it's less and less true. But in my years at the University of Vermont, I've had students, white students, who never interacted with a Black adult before. And so, I mean, that kind of question of representation is unavoidable, And in order to live there, I've learned to embrace the mission of, transforming and educating my white students. Our demographics are changing, but that has been the history of my experience there. But I also struggle with, not wanting the classes, to be too much about my experience, right? As the Black adult that they are first encountering. It informs the things I teach, but I do believe, that the experience of the classroom should happen between students. So it's a balancing act that I'm always revisiting. I think all of us who are teaching at universities where we occupy, have a unique kind of status. It's always balancing, I think, how much of ourselves we give to that experience, and how much do we let the books carry our students through. So it's something. It's a great, it brings me right into these big questions about teaching, right? And how much of ourselves do we owe our students? It's something I'm still wrestling with. Yes. Hi.
I'm part of the book club, so we
great.
discussed your book past Saturday. We had a good discussion. We had a lot of thoughts and feelings about what we read. The thing I think I want to ask you is, when you talk about your Black experience, are you evolving into your writing in expressing that it's a particular Black experience, that it's a Black experience that really happens in mostly white spaces, and in particular class and group of people? Is that something that you felt you didn't want to get into in these particular groups of essays, or is it something that you thought about expressing, or do you share that with your students?
Well, I hope that I don't know. I think that the book ultimately belongs to the readers, and how it is. I think we have to write honestly from our own experiences and then let it go. And how a reader chooses to interpret that experience belongs to that person. So I can only write from the particular of my own experience. But in terms of trying to manage a reader's, a reader's vision is not something I'm interested in doing. Once it's out there, then again, the thing that motivates me is a sense of utility. Is a story useful? And can it be productive in the life of a reader? And that's what that's what motivates me. And that's where my responsibility ends. So in terms of the specifics of class and everything else, absolutely, it's in there. And the book, what I hope for it is to become part of a conversation. Not an entire conversation. I don't think any book can carry that. And I would be suspicious of any book that was trying to carry that. And I don't particularly want to read books that are telling me how to respond. I want to be free as a reader to take what I need and to make that meaningful for me. So, right, those things are up to the reader to decide how to use them. But my responsibility ends by when I open that vein and tell the truth. Yes.
Thank you for being here. I really enjoyed your talk. I wanted to ask you, how do you encourage this liberation that can come from storytelling and narrative? And you mentioned how that is a tool. How would one sharpen that tool? Or how would one encourage their narrative? Or how do you, in the difficult moments of your life with the first interaction with the surgeon, you said that was the most difficult part to write. How did you work through that?
It's a great question. I think it's an everyday battle. I think don't you feel called to tell certain kinds of stories? And sometimes those are scary. But sometimes that fear is the evidence that that's a story you need to tell. I would never want to, again, thinking about having to make peace with the kind of artist that you are. And I'm not someone who's interested in pleasing, or conforming to a very standard kind of narrative. That doesn't interest me. But I think that sometimes that can, you create a lot of anxiety, because we want to be accepted and we want to be known, right? This great line, in There I Was Watching God, when Janie's in the courtroom and says, it wasn't death she feared, but misunderstanding. But I think that making the work is all about confronting that, and doing the scary thing. I think it honestly is just about keeping your hand moving and staying committed to the process. And the more you do it, the more you'll do it. And the freer you will be. But I think sometimes those things that are scary that make you doubt yourself are the very things that's the invitation. And that's how I think, I can only speak for myself, how I grow as a writer, to take on those things that are uncomfortable and might risk, it can have an interesting impact. I have to tell you a story. So I was giving a talk in San Diego, and there was a man, he was a faculty member, and we all went up for dinner afterward, and I could tell, someone's sort of aware of you, but they're not quite looking at you. So I had this, okay, something's coming here. Anyway, Sitting down, he made a big show of having a couple of cocktails, and he said that, wanted to be able to speak freely. And then he said to me, I protect my pain. And he said, so to me, your writing was pornographic. But it was interesting because he really needed to say this to me. But then he didn't want to engage. I was surprised. But now, of course, I'm thinking, how am I going to use this in something in writing? Because it's interesting, isn't it? But I thought about how it's not the first time, I've gotten that kind of response from what I've written. And it is unsettling, It's unsettling when you are suddenly realizing someone has read your book in a way that you didn't imagine. But again, that the longing that is human to be safe and is not enough to keep me working, So I think we have to confront those things in ourselves, and decide what is the larger mission, and then it's a daily practice after that. That's all I have to. Yes.
Were there some? I have read the book and I loved it. And were there some chapters or essays that you wrote longer ago that you reconfigured at all now for the book as your life experience increases and you as you go through life?
Well, there are. I feel like I'm a pretty slow writer. There are pieces that I wrote of these essays that were sitting in a file for 10 years. I have an essay about getting married to my husband, interstates, and the scene that essay opens with, I've been struggling with it for 10 years before I was able to really work into an essay. And I was astonished at oh my God, but it with me, it didn't leave me, but I didn't know how to make it work. So it took a long time. So the essays started like that, with these pieces and these moments that then got built. It's, I think my husband always says books are never finished, just abandoned. And so I think there was at some point I thought, okay, enough. Once I felt I had a story that had its shape. But there are so many other moments, I think, that, how do you make those decisions, that I think you have to follow the story, and then everything else kind of falls away when you have a sense of what the thread is and the path is. But right, these essays grew up and all over each other, and they had to be weeded out, and they had to, be coaxed into existence. But there are some that took many drafts, and some that sort of I knew what was happening beforehand. But I would say, yeah, it was about finding out where these places they belonged. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.